Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 6, Halacha 4, and this is going to finish up chapter 6, and if you're following along in the art scroll, it's 50a2. Now, today we're going to have a case about vegetables that are in the market, and it's no longer going to be a case where you're worried about Sheviis produce somehow in the stock of what's available there in the market. In other words, you had the 7th year, now you have the 8th year. You go to the shuk to buy some vegetables. Now you got to wonder, wait a second, could some of these onions, for example, or loof be really 6th year produce? And, at what point can you start to buy the produce without being worried that you're actually helping a Sheviis merchant? And, a Sheviis merchant is not allowed to profit on Sheviis produce even after Sheviis, even in the 8th year. If you have Sheviis produce, that's always going to be a case where you're not allowed to make money off of it. You're not allowed to market it. So the Mishnah is going to say, from when is one permitted to buy vegetables in the year following Sheviis? And this is going to be a case where, most vegetables are going to grow during Sheviis, and it's going to fall under the category of sefachin. These are going to be the aftergrowths. And the rabbis are going to forbid it. Why was that forbidden? Because they wanted to stop the cheaters and the swindlers, because they were afraid that people would come and they would, maybe, throw some seeds into the ground and then step on it. And then you'd have these seeds magically grow. And it's really what they did was, a form of covert plowing. They weren't, actually getting out the plows, but what they were doing was basically growing like a vegetable garden. And, you can stamp seeds into the ground and they'll be viable. It's a way of plowing on a very small scale. But the point is that, people would cheat and say, no, I didn't plant this. It grew naturally, from seeds that fell in the 6th year. And, I should be allowed to eat this. And the rabbis forbade it. And there's a lot of reasons why they forbade it. One would be to say, hey, follow the Torah. You're supposed to have bitachon and emunah, and you're supposed to trust in Hashem. And you're not doing it. You're planting. Another reason to do it is to make sure that there's not going to be food or a economy or market available for people to have this sort of other category of growth, namely the sefachin, the aftergrowth, and then say, oh, these are just, happen naturally, and let me just sell this and make money off of it. And they wanted to say, no, that's cut off. And, the idea here is that the rabbis are concerned that, the vegetables that are being sold in the beginning of the 8th year might have actually been picked in the Sheviis year, and that's going to make them subject to this ban on sefachin. And the idea is that they want to, one, cut off any cheaters, and number two, they want to make sure that Sheviis merchants are not having produce to sell. So at what point can you go to the market and then buy this, produce where it's actually going to be the 8th year and not worry about it? What's going to be the cutoff? So the Gemara says, from when comparable ones that were planted after Sheviis have developed, and once vegetables in the early ripening locations have developed, even those in late ripening locations are permitted. So you have in the Halacha many areas in Eretz Yisrael, and some areas are going to be famous for growing certain crops and are going to have that crop grow faster than in other areas. So for instance, if you have a wheat field down in Jerusalem, or even south of Jerusalem, and you're looking at a wheat field far in the north, generally speaking, the wheat field in the south is gonna get this 1/3 ripeness at a quicker date than the colder area in the north, if you're doing like a winter wheat. So there's going to be also other vegetable species that are going to ripen differently. We were talking about valleys. In valleys, the groundwater stays in the earth longer, and you don't need to do an irrigation program because it holds the the water longer. So the idea that we're talking about is that when you have vegetables or crops planted after Sheviis, okay, and it grows to a point where it can be offered for sale, we can be lenient, and we can assume that this is now being sold in the New Year's crop. And the idea is that since the sefachin is going to be d'Rabbanan, we can assume that, it must be that the majority of this is going to be this 8th year crop. And we have a general law in Judaism that whenever you have a biblical requirement and you have a rabbinic requirement, if you have a case where you have something come up and there's a suffix and it's going to be a biblical requirement, we're always going to rule stringently on it. And in a case where you have a suffix come up and there's going to be an issue there that's d'Rabbanan, it's always going to be lenient. And so that's why this is going to be lenient on here. In other words, you have these crops, they're already, getting ready in the field, and they're starting to get available into the market. And you could say, yeah, but some of these might be sefachim. Some of these might actually be 7th year growth. And you would say, okay, but that's a suffix. And you would say, okay, but, this is a d'Rabbanan issue with sefachim. And in a case where you have this leniency, you have a leniency here. In a case where you have this doubt, the 8th year fruit, the 8th year vegetable, the 8th year crop is going to be treated leniently because it's not going to be enough to nullify it. Now, the question in what we were talking about in Halacha 3 is going to be a case where perhaps, with the case of the onions, that perhaps this new 7th year growth and going into the 8th year for an onion that's plucked and then replanted in the 8th year, perhaps this is actually going to be a d'oraita prohibition. And so it looked like yesterday that perhaps, you're going to have a Beur on this kind of onion because you would say that, this onion grew in the 7th year, and just because it increased in size, you would say that perhaps it's going to be a case where it's already a d'oraita thing. It's already d'oraita that you can't eat these onions. So the Gemara is going to have a dissenting opinion, and Rebbe permitted buying vegetables immediately following Sheviis. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the history of this. There was pressure at certain points in Rebbe's term where there was pressure by the Roman government. And Rebbe was initially forbidding vegetables come into the land from outside of Eretz Yisrael, even in non-Sheviis years. And the idea is that, they were worried about, Tamei earth being brought in with the other vegetables, and it would spread tumah. And this was, obviously, this tumah thing is going to be a d'Rabbanan issue. It's not a d'oraita issue. And they were worried that you'd have, bone fragments put into there. But what happened was you had a lot of food shortages and you had a lot of pressure from the Roman government. And there was this ban that they had on importing foreign produce got repealed, and then they allowed it. And they allowed it even immediately after Sheviis. So during the Sheviis year itself, Rebbe did not rely on imported produce, and the idea was, they did import it, but before the ban, they didn't allow it, and then they were worried that there would be food shortages and people wouldn't grow enough and people wouldn't have enough, and because there was just a big disruption to the agricultural economy. So when he's saying, okay, Rebbe permitted buying vegetables immediately after Sheviis, you have to understand the context of when this is. There's a change in the ruling because of an economic problem that comes about. We know that, hey, if you have pekuach nefesh issues, that's going to be serious. And, you have big pekuach nefesh issues if you're having food scarcity problems for an entire nation. So the Mishnah goes to a new topic, and it talks about categories of produce that are forbidden to be exported from Eretz Yisrael. So the Mishnah says one may not remove oil that must be burned, in other words, contaminated truma, or Sheviis produce from the land of Israel to outside the land. And the ban on exporting Sheviis produce is going to be connected with this Beur obligation, because with this Beur obligation, there's a debate on it. There's a maloket. Some of the people say that it has to be left out for even the animals to be able to eat it, has to be destroyed, or so there's that idea that it has to be destroyed, has to be left out. Some people say it can be left out as hefker, in which case you can go back and reclaim it. But if that is going to be the case where you have to leave it out to be destroyed and even for the animals to eat it, then, how can you do that outside of the land? Because it's talking about in the land. And so this prohibition against removing Sheviis produce from Eretz Yisrael might have something to do with this Beur restriction. And the issue would come up that, it is rabbinically forbidden to remove Sheviis produce from Eretz Yisrael even before the time of Beur has come up, to make sure that the procedure of Beur becomes necessary, and it will be done in Eretz Yisrael, because part of the way the verses work is that it's for the land. So you have to leave it out in the land and even make it available to the animals there. So the Torah's Kohanim has a little bit different take on it, and the Vilna Goan is going to explain it. But the idea over there is that the prohibition against removing Sheviis from Eretz Yisrael includes a ban on the consumption of Sheviis produce that's exported. And the idea is that, produce that's taken out of the land is forbidden to be eaten. And the Chazan Ish rules that illegally exported etrogim of Sheviis may be used on Sukkot, since they are permitted for consumption. But it looks like there could be bans, not because of the Beur, but because of the worry about eating it outside of the land. So, what about the oil? And we know that if oil that's truma becomes tamei, it's supposed to be burned, and a Kohen is not allowed to eat it. And the burning of it is a precautionary measure to make sure that they don't eat it. But when you have to burn it, the Kohen still gets to derive benefit from it. So he can use it for fuel for a fire or for a lamp. And because the Kohen is going to benefit from the contaminated truma oil by burning it, it's oil that must be burned. And so truma that is tahor may not be taken out of Eretz Yisrael, because it would be contaminated with this rabbinic tuma from the lands, and you're not allowed to contaminate truma. So the Mishnah here is saying that, wait a second, even if it's already contaminated, you still can't take it out of Eretz Yisrael. And this is going to apply even in non-Sheviis years. And it's a lot of deep ideas on why even the contaminated truma oil can't be taken out. The Mishnah continues, and Rebbe said, I heard explicitly that one may remove Sheviis produce to Syria, but one may not remove it to any place outside of the land of Israel. So regarding Syria, we learned before in earlier part of chapter 6, it would be Halacha 2, chapter 6, that Syria is not considered part of Eretz Yisrael on a biblical level, but the Tanna Kama is making no distinction between Syria and other foreign land, and is going to prohibit the removal of Sheviis produce even to Syria. But Rebbe is going to disagree with that, and that's why he's saying that Rebbe said, I heard explicitly. So in regards to this, it's going to consider Syria to be completely equal to Eretz Yisrael in all respects, and therefore Syria is going to be an eligible location where you can carry out the Beur, and then since you can carry out the Beur in Syria, there's no reason to prohibit exporting Sheviis produce there. So Rebbe's leniency might be due to the fact that some of the laws of Sheviis are rabbinically applicable in Syria, and since the people of Syria are accustomed to observing the Sheviis regulations, there would be no need to fear that the Sheviis produce brought from Eretz Yisrael would be treated improperly. So in other words, they're saying that they're religious enough over there that they are still going to follow all the laws of Sheviis. And so that might be part of the restrictions that we saw in Halacha 2. In other words, they're observant enough to follow it, and ergo, if they're observant enough to follow the laws about plowing and working the land, so too they would be treating the produce carefully and also respect the laws of Beur. In the final section of the Mishnah, it's going to talk about truma that could be brought into Eretz Yisrael, and the Mishnah says one may not bring truma from outside of the land into the land. So under biblical law, truma and meiser from agricultural produce is going to be for that which grows in Eretz Yisrael. But there's an enactment that goes back to the time of the prophets that required truma and meiser to be separated from produce growing in Bavel and Egypt and Ammon and Moab, and even though those are areas that are outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now in Syria, it was going to also be subject to tithing, but that's going to be d'Rabbanan. So this Mishnah is trying to teach that truma of these foreign lands may not be brought into Eretz Yisrael, and the Gemara is going to get into why. The Mishnah says, Rebbe said, I heard explicitly that one may bring truma into Eretz Yisrael from Syria, but one may not bring in truma from outside the land. So regarding this, Rebbe is ending this Mishnah with a statement where he's doing a reiteration of the Tanna Kamma's ruling on foreign lands, and the extra statement is informing us that just as it's permissible, in Rebbe's opinion, to bring truma of Syria into Eretz Yisrael, so too you're not allowed to bring truma of other lands into Syria. So the Gemara now is going to get going. It's going to talk about the difference on when one can purchase. How quickly can you purchase vegetables from a market right after Sheviis in the 8th year? And the Gemara says, at first, foreign-grown vegetables were forbidden from import, even to the border settlements of the lands of Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara is saying that when Rebbe saw that the border settlements could not abide by this restriction, in other words, that you had these very close settlements along the border, and it made it very difficult for people who live there to follow the ban on importing vegetables. And many of the settlements' residents themselves might have owned fields in neighboring border lands on the other side of Eretz Yisrael. So the Rosh Hashanah is pointing out that enforcing the ban in these areas was seen to be unreasonable. And the Gemara is going to say that they instituted that foreign-grown vegetables should be permitted to import to the border settlements of the land of Israel. Nonetheless, it was still prohibited to bring these vegetables from outside of the land into the central areas of the land, and the rabbis subsequently instituted that it should be permissible to bring vegetables from outside of the land into all parts of the land. And the idea is that you had a restriction against importing vegetables to the central parts, and it gets abolished because there's not enough locally grown food at this time. And I want to point out that lifting the ban, when it's talking about lifting the ban, that's also going to be cited anonymously. We assume that's going to be Rebbe who's saying that. So the Gemara is going to continue. So, by the way, so at first they said, no, you can't, on the border areas, import land, farm, produce from land that's outside of the land, even to the border area. They saw that the people couldn't comply with it. Many of them had fields in the outside of Eretz Yisrael area, and so they were still going to be growing and bringing it into Eretz Yisrael. So they said, fine, you can do it. And then they saw food scarcity shortage, and they said, okay, whereas before you weren't allowed to bring it from a border area into Eretz Yisrael, now you can. Now you can bring it into the central part because of a scarcity issue. So the Gemara is going to continue and say, nevertheless, it was still prohibited to buy vegetables immediately following Sheviis, and despite lifting the ban against importing vegetables, one did not have the right to assume that the vegetables available in the market actually originate from outside Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara is going to say that Rebbe permitted buying vegetables immediately following Sheviis because he determined that most of the vegetables being marketed at the beginning of the 8th year were going to be from foreign areas. So again, we had a restriction before that you're not allowed to bring vegetables in or produce in from outside of Eretz Yisrael because you're worried that these clumps of earth that are going to be on these vegetables are going to have bone chips in them. It's going to make the land tameh. You're not allowed to contaminate the land. You're not allowed to introduce more tuma into the land. So the other problem is that you're worried that people who are actually careful about Torah with their food, that you might accidentally be making them tameh. So it makes it more difficult to control levels of tuma. Now you have a problem where you're having food shortages, and you have Roman oppression at this time, and Rebbe lifts it and says that you can bring in foreign land vegetables, and the idea here is that he's going to allow it immediately because he's saying that the vegetables that are coming in from the foreign lands are, probably foreign land vegetables, and it's, not subject to Sheviis anyway, so you don't need to worry that at the start of the 8th year that these vegetables might be really sefachim. And he continues and he says, but there's an exception with the leek. So the idea here is that Rebbe was under the impression that leeks generally were not imported from outside of Eretz Yisrael, and he therefore disallowed the purchase in the 8th year until there was enough locally grown crop to be available in the markets. And once you have the majority of the market having the local leeks, then it's going to be allowed. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, what did the residents of Sippori do with the leek so that Rebbe may reconsider the status? And it says that they took it and dressed it in sackcloth and ashes. And this was trying to make it look, says the Pnei Moshe, as if the leek is like a person and it's lamenting its misfortune and it's mourning itself. And the people of Sippori, they came and they brought this leek dressed up in sackcloth and ashes, and they brought it before Rebbe, and they said to him, in what way has this leek sinned more than all the other vegetables, that it's unlike the rest? Is it not permitted to purchase it immediately following Sheviis? And upon hearing this claim, Rebbe permitted the leek to them. So Rebbe was convinced that the leeks are going to actually be commonly imported from outside of the land. And the Vilna Goan is going to read this a little bit differently. He's going to say that Rebbe permitted the purchase of vegetables immediately after Sheviis, and the true reasoning behind Rebbe's leniency is that he held that within 2 or 3 days of the start of the 8th year, there are already enough 8th year vegetables of a size comparable to the ones that grew during Sheviis, And Rebbe is not introducing a new reason. He's just simply stating the limit given by the Tanna Kama, and that's going to be at the very beginning of the 8th year. So that's a very cute story. There's another relevant story that comes up. Ula bar Yishmael relates the following incident in the name of Rabbi Hanina. And Rebbe and Rabbi Yosei of Bar Yuda went down to Akko, and shortly after the conclusion of Sheviis, and were received by the guests of Rabbi Manna. Now I want to explain, there's 4 Rabbi Mannas in the Yerushalmi. This Rabbi Manna is going to be the son who's the head of the academy. And so this is going to be an earlier, I think this is the earliest Rabbi Manna that's in the Yerushalmi. Is going to be the son of, I believe it's the son of Rabbi Yudah. So this is a very early Rabbi Manna. This is not the same Rabbi Manna, who's the head of the academy in Sipori. So Rabbi Manna is one of the people who receives him, and Rebbe said to Rabbi Manna, "Prepare for us a pan of vegetables." And the Gemara says instead he prepared for them a meat dish. And the following day, Rebbe said to Rabbi Manna, "Prepare for us a pan of vegetables." And instead, he prepared for him a poultry dish. And Rebbe exclaims in this response, because it's not typical, he says, this individual, Rabbi Manna, is discerned to be from the entrance of the academy of Shmuel. This is talking about Shmuel in Bava. And in other words, he's saying that, he's following Shmuel's shita, that Shmuel was known to have disagreed with Rebbe's leniency about the produce of vegetables in the beginning of the 8th year. And basically, Rabbi Manna is following this view that he refrained from buying vegetables, and instead, he served him meat and poultry. And Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Yudah, disagreeing with this assessment of Rabbi Manna's conduct, said to Rebbe that he is not even from the entrance of the academy of Shmuel, and his conduct can't be attached to him being a disciple of Shmuel. And he says, yes, it's true that Shmuel rejects Rebbe's general permit to buy vegetables immediately after Sheviis. He does not accept it with regards to the border settlements, and Akko is a border settlement. So Shmuel is holding that it's allowed to permit the import of vegetables into these border settlements, and as a result, these areas are not having any restrictions against purchasing vegetables immediately after Sheviis. So then the question is, well, why didn't Rabbi Manna serve him vegetables? And that's what the Gemara asks. It says, so indeed, why did Rabbi Manna act this way and not serve him vegetables? And the Gemara says, because this disciple, Rabbi Manna, is of the disciples of Rabbi Yudah. And Rabbi Yudah said, vegetables are forbidden for import even to the border settlements of Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbi Yudah and Rabbi Manna is the son of Rabbi Yudah. Rabbi Yudah is the head of the academy. And this is, again, a very, very early time. And basically, Rabbi Yudah is holding by this earlier position that if you have an area on a border settlement, you have farms in foreign land, you still can't import the vegetables to a border settlement. So he's taking the original stance, and Rabbi Manna is basically following his father. So basically, he's saying that vegetables are forbidden for import even to the border settlements of Eretz Yisrael. Now the idea is that since you had some locally grown vegetables in the 8th year, and they're only going to be available, they're not going to be available yet in Eretz Yisrael, and basically, what's growing outside of Eretz Yisrael, it can't be brought in and it can't be served yet. You have to wait for the produce in Eretz Yisrael. Why would there be a delay? Because you can't work the land in the 7th year. So you're going to get an earlier crop in the 8th year, for the produce coming from outside of Eretz Yisrael than in the Eretz Yisrael, because again, they can work the land and you can't. So basically, Rabbi Manna is serving them other food because he's holding by Rabbi Yudah and saying that you can't bring in this crop yet. It's not, and the crop in Eretz Yisrael in the 8th year is not ready yet. So the Gemara continues and says, when Rabbi Manna came to Rebbe on a different occasion, he recounted to him the preceding incident. And Rebbe said to him, "You should have acted in accordance with our view and served us the vegetables like we requested in order to avoid potentially being punished as one who promotes controversy." So, in other words, Rabbi Manna gets reminded by Rebbe at a later date that he refused to serve him these vegetables. And he's basically saying that, you shouldn't have done it to highlight there's a maloket on it. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss another law that was impacted by lifting the ban against importing the foreign produce. And we learned in a Mishnah there, this is going to be a Mishnah over in Nedarim 6:8. By the way, there's a lot of connections between the Mishnahs in Nedarim and Sheviis. Anyway, we're going to continue and we're going to see why, because actually Sheviis is going to be a promise that Hashem makes, and Hashem always keeps his promises. Anyway, the Gemara continues, and it says that one who vows to abstain from vegetables is permitted in vegetables of the field and wild vegetables because it has this additional title. So in talking about wild vegetables, one does not refer to them as vegetables, but rather vegetables of the field. And the unmodified term includes only vegetables cultivated in the garden. And this is because people consider garden vegetables more suitable for consumption than wild vegetables. And since the language of a vow is always interpreted according to the common language, one who vows to abstain from vegetables is only banned from garden vegetables, not the wild vegetables. So the Gemara continues and says, it was taught in a brisa that explains on this Mishnah, one who vows during Sheviis to abstain from vegetables is prohibited even in vegetables of the field, since cultivable vegetables are not available in the Sheviis year, and therefore the vower must have been referring to wild vegetables that sprouted on their own in the fields. So the idea here is during Sheviis, when people can't work the land and can't cultivate, a vow prohibiting vegetables is clearly also going to refer to that which grows in the wild. And so it goes to say that, somebody who's going to make a vow is going to include garden vegetables that remain from the 6th year. And, according to this text, one who vows during Sheviis to abstain from vegetables is going to basically be putting a neder on himself, not only for wild vegetables, but also for the garden vegetables. And so, because we have Sheviis, so the ruling here gets clarified, and the Gemara says that Rabbi Crispa taught this preceding brisa in the name of Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel, and said the following explanation, and that rule, which was stated in the brisa, that the term vegetables takes on a more expansive meaning during the Sheviis year, and it was applicable only before Rebbe permitted bringing vegetables from outside of the land into the land. But once Rebbe permitted bringing vegetables from outside of the land of Eretz Yisrael into the land, the Sheviis year is the same as the other years of the 7th year cycle. So they can vow to abstain from vegetables, and that would refer specifically to cultivated vegetables, and not only those that grow in the wild. Now, there's another law that changes as a result of the import of vegetables. And Rabbi Yosef Bar Hanina says, wild endives are deemed significant enough during Sheviis to contract food tuma. So wild endives, there's going to be two kinds. There's going to be a garden one, and there's going to be a field one. And we know that from the Mishnah in Kalayim 1:2. And Mara Fulda is saying that the garden endives are cultivated for human consumption, and they're tasty. And the wild one had a more bitter taste, so they were not generally as favored by people. But I think in some of the modern cooking, I think that bitter taste is pretty popular, just between you and me. But anyway, so the idea here is that, even without having specific intent to eat these wild endives, they do not have this significance in the other years, so that garden endives are definitely not available in Sheviis because you can't work the land to grow them. And, it's not going to be ready immediately after Sheviis either. And the wild endives are going to be eaten instead. And, this is just going to grow naturally every year in the land. And it's, question if it's in Kalayim is it treated like a different species or not? And the wild endive is going to be eaten instead, and the wild variety is basically going to be elevated to the status of food in the Sheviis year, and so it's going to be deemed susceptible to tuma. By the way, this might also be applicable right after the 8th year if you're not allowing foreign imports. So there's going to be reasoning behind why this is, and the Gemara says that this was said only before Rebbe permitted the importation of vegetables into Eretz Yisrael, since at that time the garden endives could neither be cultivated nor imported in Sheviis, and basically the wild endives are going to be elevated to have the status of food, and once it has the status of food, it can contract tuma. But once Rebbe permitted the importation of vegetables into Eretz Yisrael, the Sheviis year is the same as the rest of the years in a 7-year cycle. And in respect to the wild endives, they're not going to be susceptible to food tuma unless you have a specific intent to use them as food and eat them. And garden endives, now that you can have importation, there's going to be no need for people to eat the wild ones. And so even during Sheviis, they're not going to be considered food. So again, if you have the intention to eat them, though, they will be susceptible to tuma. This is sort of a Talmudic point. The Mishnah is going to say that one may not take out oil that must be burned for Sheviis, outside of the land, and you can't take produce from Sheviis outside of the land. And the Gemara is going to clarify the position of the Tanna Kama regarding the export of Sheviis produce to Syria. Again, there's a disagreement between the Tanna Kama and Rebbe. So this is going to be the Tanna Kama's point. And the Gemara is going to say at first, the students of the academy wanted to say that the Tanna Kama and Rebbe do not disagree. And when Rebbe stated that Sheviis produce may be exported to Syria, he was merely clarifying the law presented by the Tanna Kama based on what he heard. Now, it was found out later that a Baraisa teaches the following dispute regarding the law. Rabbi Yehuda says one may transport Sheviis produce only until Ketziv, which lies in the northern extremity of the land, sanctified in the days of Ezra. And Rabbi Shimon says it may be taken even farther north until Amana. We covered this before, and Amana might even be up toward the borders of Turkey. So, despite not having been sanctified in the days of Eretz Yisrael or of Ezra, it's going to be considered part of the land of Israel as far as this law is concerned. So both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon are agreeing that it is forbidden to remove Sheviis produce to Syria, because Syria has less sanctity than the areas between Ketziv and Amana. But they're saying, since it's clear from this Baraisa that Rebbe's position is not unanimous, it may be assumed that the Tanna Kama as well disagrees with him, and he prohibits the removal of Sheviis produce to Syria. So the Baraisa is now going to discuss the disposition of Sheviis produce that was illegally or accidentally taken out of Eretz Yisrael. So it says, okay, don't do it. But now that it's been done, what do you do with it? How do you treat it? Because, again, you have Beur. How do you handle it? And there was a brisa that taught Sheviis produce or fruits of the land, Sheviis fruits of the land that were removed outside of the land may undergo Beur in their place when the time of Beur arrives. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says one must bring them back into the land and perform Beur there. For it is written, and for the animal and for the beast that is in your land shall all its produce be to eat. The idea here is that this verse in the Torah, this verse, by the way, you can find it in Leviticus 25:7. The idea is basically the source for the Beur obligation, and it's indicating that the act of Beur must be carried out in your land. And where is your land? It's in Eretz Yisrael. So you can't have the animals in your land eat it if you're taking it out to Iraq, because just because you put it out there doesn't fulfill the requirements of this verse. Now, the Gemara is going to present a ruling on this, and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says Rabbi Imi ruled in accordance with the first Tana in this brisa. That's going to be Rabbi Shimon, and to be lenient and allow the performance of Beur outside of the land. Now, this leniency is going to get qualified, though. Okay, so Rabbi Hillel is going to, according to Mara Fulda, explain that you have to perform Beur as soon as this obligation comes in, and you may not cause a delay by transporting the produce from place to place. In other words, once it happens and it's outside, and you're, say, in Iraq or somewhere very far away, you have to put it outside right away. So Rabbi Hillel adds a qualification. He says one may indeed perform Beur on the exported Sheviis outside of the land of Israel. However, he may not move the produce from place to place once the time of Beur has arrived. Rather, Beur must be performed in the location where the produce is situated. So they want to make sure that people can't play games with it. And then once it happens, it's put outside, and that's the end of it. And then you have the last section of the Mishnah. It says one may not bring truma from outside the land into the land. And Rebbe said, I heard explicitly that one may bring it from Syria, but one may not bring it from outside the land. Now, according to Tanna Kama, there's a disagreement between the Tanna Kama and Rebbe on this. So, they're saying that it's forbidden to bring truma from Syria into Eretz Yisrael. So that's the position of the Tanna Kama. So there's an objection to that. And the Gemara says, we learned in the Mishnah there, this Mishnah being in Chala 4:5, it says, a certain individual named Ariston brought his Beurim to Jerusalem from the city of Apima. And Apima is probably a reference to Spain. And that's the note by the Rosh Cyrilia. And the Gemara is going to continue. There's also an opinion that it's actually going to be Syria. So there's two opinions. One is that he came from Ipamia, which is Spain, and the other is going to be that it's Apamia, which is Syria. And let's just say that he's talking about the Syria one, not the Spanish one. But there's two opinions on which exactly it was. But let's just say, to keep it easy, let's say it's the Syria one. So Ariston brings his Beurim from Jerusalem from the city of Apamia. And by the way, if he did this from Spain, it would have a slightly different implication than if he's bringing it from Syria. And the Gemara says that they accepted the Beurim from him. And the Gemara says that if a resident of Syria is allowed to bring Beurim into Eretz Yisrael, we should see that certainly he should be allowed to bring Truma, which has less sanctity than Beurim, into Eretz Yisrael. So why does the Tanna Kama prohibit this? And the Gemara is going to answer that there's a basic difference between Beurim and Truma, and this is why you're going to have a stringency for Beurim. Rabbi Hoshaya said, bringing Beurim to Jerusalem is under the owner's responsibility. The idea is that even after you designate the first ripened fruits as Beurim, you have not fulfilled the obligation until the fruits are actually brought to the temple. And by contrast, the giving of the truma to a kohen is not under the owner's responsibility. And if you will say that truma may be imported into Eretz Yisrael from other lands, the kohanim themselves will be inclined to leave Eretz Yisrael, which you're not allowed to do because they'll become tamei. And what they'll do is they'll run around and they'll chase truma outside of the land. And they wanted to keep them here. And the kohanim are not allowed to contaminate themselves with corpse-related tumah, by the way. And so, if they're going into foreign land, they're going to contaminate themselves. So, to keep kohanim from going outside and collecting truma and then bringing it home, the rabbis are going to impose a universal ban on importing truma into Eretz Yisrael. And with regards to Beurim, this is not a concern since the owner of the Beurim is also going to be required to bring it to the temple anyway. And consequently, there's no reason to prohibit bringing Beurim from outside of Eretz Yisrael. And that is going to highlight the difference between Beurim and truma, but it helps us to learn a lot of different aspects of law. And this is going to conclude chapter 6. And we're going to get into chapter 7. And we're going to talk about deeper parts about wasting and destroying the produce. And we're going to talk about deeper ideas about in the scripture, like where it says for you to eat. And this is going to tie it more to the scripture to understand this stuff. Anyway, have a great day.